Hi, my name is Colin Cairns. I am a tutor here at the Baker College of Auburn Hills Learning Center. Today I'm going to review a PowerPoint on Anatomy and Physiology 2, Chapter 15, the Cardiovascular System, and I will shortly pull up the PowerPoint for you to view. Introduction to this Chapter 15, the Cardiovascular System. The heart pumps 7,000 liters of blood throughout the body each day. The heart contracts some 2.5 billion times in an average lifetime. The heart and all the blood vessels make up the cardiovascular system. The blood vessels make up two circuits, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit delivers oxygen to all the body cells and carries away waste. The oxygen carbon dioxide exchange takes place in the alveoli of the lung tissue. After the CO2 is given back into the blood, that blood returns to the heart via the inferior or superior vena cava. It enters the right atrium, goes through a valve to the right ventricle, and then is pumped into the lungs via the pulmonary arch and the pulmonary arteries. In the pulmonary circuit, the carbon dioxide is eliminated and the blood is reoxygenated. The oxygenated blood returns to the heart via the pulmonary veins. It enters the left atrium and is pumped by the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve to the aortic arch and the aorta, and is pumped to all the body tissues in the body. A little bit about the structure of the heart. The heart's a hollow cone-shaped muscular pump. There are four chambers, the two atria, and the two ventricles. One's a low pressure pump, the right side, and one's a high pressure pump, the left side. The size and location of the heart is this next slide. The heart size varies with body size. The heart lies in the thoracic cavity. The average size of a heart is 14 centimeters long and 9 centimeters wide. It's located posterior to the sternum, medial to the lungs, anterior to the vertebral column. The base of the heart lies beneath the second rib. The apex is located at the fifth intercostal space. and it lays just above the diaphragm. This slide just shows a picture of the heart. You can see being resting almost on the diaphragm. The coverings of the heart include the fibrous pericardium, the visceral pericardium, and the parietal pericardium. And the heart wall has three distinct layers: the epicardium outer layer, the myocardium or heart muscle middle layer, and the endocardium inner layer of epithelial tissue. And some of the functions of each layer: the epicardium forms a protective outer covering, secretes serous fluid. The myocardium contracts to pump blood from the heart chambers, and the endocardium forms a protective inner lining of the chambers and the valves. The heart is divided into four chambers. The right atrium receives blood from the inferior or superior vena cava and the coronary sinus. The right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium. On the left side, the left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary veins, and the left ventricle receives blood from the left atrium. The valves of the heart: there are four valves. The tricuspid, which is located in the right atrioventricular orifice. It prevents blood from moving from the right ventricle back into the right atrium during ventricular contraction. The pulmonary valve, which is in the entrance to the pulmonary trunk, prevents blood from moving from the pulmonary trunk back into the right ventricle during ventricular relaxation. The mitral valve, which is located in the left atrioventricular orifice, prevents blood from moving from the left ventricle back into the left atrium during ventricular contraction. And the aortic valve, which is located at the entrance to the aorta, prevents blood from moving from the aorta back into the left ventricle during ventricular relaxation. This slide shows a picture of the different, the cross section. Here's a cross section showing the inner aspects of the heart, the septum. You can see the chordae tendineae, papillary muscles. Here's a pulmonary valve, and a cross section of tricuspid valve with three cusps, and the mitral valve or the two cusp valve. And another picture of some of the cusps, a cross section laid open of the cusps, and also the intraventricular septum and the papillary muscles. The skeleton of the heart is actually the fibrous rings in the portion of the septum between the ventricles. That would be the skeleton of the heart, just kind of the framework of the heart that holds it together. And here's the path of the blood through the heart. As you can see, we have a gas exchange in systemic capillaries, and the CO2 enters the bloodstream. So this is deoxygenated blood that enters the right atrium and goes through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle it passes through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary arch, and either goes to the left lung or the right lung via the pulmonary arteries. Once it enters the lungs, there's a gas exchange again in the alveolar capillaries, and now oxygenated blood is sent by the pulmonary veins to either from each side, each lung, pulmonary veins from each lung, to the left side of the heart. It enters the left atrium, goes through the mitral valve to the left ventricle, and then is pumped by the left ventricle through the aortic valve and out through the aorta, and either is sent, one branch of the aorta is descending, and there's an ascending branch that sends it to the upper portion of the body. And then the process starts all over again when the oxygenated blood is in the tissue cells, and it's going to start being used up by the tissue cells. And here is a chart, kind of a flow chart, showing the blood from the systemic circuit and entering the vena cava and heading to the right atrium to the tricuspid valve, to the right ventricle, and pumped through the pulmonary valve, to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, to the alveolar capillaries, and through the pulmonary veins back to the heart again in the left atrium, through the mitral valve to the left ventricle, and that blood is pumped through the aortic valve to the aorta, and that blood is sent to the systemic circuit. As far as the blood supply to the heart itself, the left and right coronary arteries supply blood to the tissues of the heart. So the heart supplies blood to the body, but blood also has to be supplied to the heart itself. So the aorta sends blood to the right coronary artery or the left coronary artery. The right coronary artery has two divisions, the posterior interventricular artery and then the marginal artery. And then blood is sent either to the capillaries in the ventricular walls or the capillaries in the walls of the right atrium and right ventricle. Left coronary artery divides into the circumflex and the anterior interventricular artery, and then that blood is sent either to the myocardial capillaries in the walls of the left atrium and left ventricle, or the myocardial capillaries in the ventricular walls. Then the blood is pumped to the cardiac veins through the coronary sinus and then to the right atrium. And here's a picture of aorta detached from aortic valve, showing the valve cusp. This is semilunar valve. Section 15.3 is on heart actions. The heart chambers function in a coordinated fashion. Heart actions are regulated so that atria contract while ventricles relax. The contraction is called systole, relaxation is called diastole. And then that is followed by ventricles contracting while the atria relax. So while the atria is contracting, ventricles relax, as the atria is pumping blood into the ventricles, and when the blood is pumped in, the ventricles contract to pump it out, and the atria relax while that's happening. And it shows you that the tricuspid valve, the mitral valves, open first, and blood comes in to the right and left ventricles, and then the pulmonary valves are closed while that's happening. So we have systole in the atria while we have diastole in the ventricles, and then when that's done, the ventricles contract and the aortic and pulmonary valves open so the blood can flow out, while the other valves, the tricuspid and mitral valves, will close while the atria relax. The cardiac cycle is the pressure in the heart, the chamber rise and falls during that cycle, and in atrial systole and ventricular diastole, blood flows passively into the ventricles. The remaining 30% of it is pushed into the ventricles. The AV valves open, the semilunar valves close, the ventricles relax. This causes an increase in ventricular pressure. In ventricular systole and atrial diastole, the AV valves close, The chordate tendinate prevent the cusp of the valves from bulging too far in the atria. The atria relax, the blood flows in the atria. The ventricular pressure increases and opens the semilunar valves, and the blood flows into the pulmonary trunk and aorta. And here's an animation of the cardiac cycle.
Ventricular contraction causes the atrioventricular valves to close, which signals the beginning of ventricular systole. The semilunar valves were closed during the previous diastole and remain closed during this period. Continued ventricular contraction increases pressure in the ventricles above the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary trunk, causing the semilunar valves to open. When the ventricles relax and their pressures drop, blood flowing back toward the relaxed ventricles causes the semilunar valves to close, which is the beginning of ventricular diastole. Note that the atrioventricular valves remain closed. When the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in the atria, the atrioventricular valves open and blood flows into the relaxed ventricles. This accounts for most of the ventricular filling. The atria then contract and complete the ventricular filling.
There's some of the mechanical events of the cardiac cycle. And it shows how the blood is flowing and back into, and then the ejection through the ventricles and ventricular filling. The heart sounds, the heartbeat through the stethoscope sounds like a lub dup. The lub is the first heart sound. It occurs during ventricular contraction. The AV valves are closing. The dup, the second heart sound, occurs during ventricular diastole or relaxation. The pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves are closing. A murmur is a normal heart sound from the cusp that are not completely closing. Here's a slide. It just shows tricuspid area, where you would hear the heart sounds. The cardiac muscle fibers form a functional syncytium. This is a mass of cells that function as a unit. Two such areas exist in the heart. In the atrial walls, it's called the atrial syncytium. And in the ventricular walls, it's called a ventricular syncytium. And we're going to look at a slide, animation about the action potentials in the sinoatrial SA node. And as you can see, we first have potassium flowing out and sodium flowing in, and the calcium channels are closed, and then the calcium sodium is going in, and then when that's complete, it shows the membrane potential rising, and then we have calcium opening, and it spikes the membrane potential. And then once that happens and it closes up again, we have a drop. And we might get again as the potassium flows out. A drop in the potassium. And that was it. Okay. Let's move on here. Same one I just played, actually. It's like, oops, let's go back one. Okay, the cardiac conduction system clumps of strands of specialized cardiac muscle tissue which initiate and distribute impulses throughout the myocardium. The cardiac conduction system coordinates the events of the cardiac cycle. So we start with the SA node. The impulse is conducted to the atrial syncytium. It's also conducted through the junctional fibers to the AV node, and then the AV bundle, and then it's sent along to the right and left bundle branches, and then the Purkinje fibers, and eventually to the ventricular syncytium. And here's an animation of the conducting system of the heart.
Action potentials originate in the sinoatrial node and travel across the wall of the atrium from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node. Action potentials pass slowly through the atrioventricular node to give the atria time to contract. They then pass rapidly along the atrioventricular bundle, which extends from the atrioventricular node through the fibrous skeleton into the interventricular septum. The atrioventricular bundle divides into right and left bundle branches, and action potentials descend rapidly to the apex of each ventricle along the bundle branches. Action potentials are carried by the Purkinje fibers from the bundle branches to the ventricular walls. The rapid conduction from the atrioventricular bundle to the ends of the Purkinje fibers allows the ventricular muscle cells to contract in unison, providing a strong contraction.
And here's just a cross-section sketch of how the conduction system works from the SA node to the AV node to the junctional fibers to the AV bundle, the right and left bundle branches that are located in the septum, and then that's distributed to the Purkinje fibers. Slide 15.1 is about replacing the heart from transplant to stem cell implants. There's nothing else on that. An EKG or ECG is a recording of electrical changes that occur in the myocardium during the cardiac cycle. It's used to assess the heart's ability to conduct impulses. The deflections in a normal ECG or waves include the P wave, which signifies atrial depolarization, QRS complex, which is actually made up of 3 waves, which signifies ventricular depolarization, and a T wave, which signifies ventricular repolarization. And let's have an animation of the baroreceptor reflex control of blood pressure.
Increased blood pressure stretches the carotid arteries and aorta, causing the baroreceptors to increase their basal rate of action potential generation. Action potentials are conducted by the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to the cardioregulatory and vasomotor centers in the medulla oblongata. As a result of increased stimulation from the baroreceptors, the cardioregulatory center increases parasympathetic stimulation to the heart, which decreases the heart rate. Also, as a result of the increased stimulation from the baroreceptors, the cardiovascular center decreases sympathetic stimulation to the heart, which decreases heart rate and stroke volume. The vasomotor center decreases sympathetic stimulation to blood vessels, causing vasodilation. The vasodilation, along with the decreased heart rate and decreased stroke volume, bring the elevated blood pressure back toward normal. If the initial problem were a decrease in blood pressure, the activities and effects of the baroreceptors, cardiovascular center, and vasomotor center would be the opposite of what is illustrated.
And here's a illustration of what's going on in the PQRST waves. First we start the P wave, the atrial depolarization, and then when that's finished, that's the full P wave. Then when the atrial repolarization occurs and the ventricular depolarization starts to occur, we have the QRS, and then it comes back up to the baseline when there's full depolarization of the ventricles. And then as the wave starts to deflect upward towards to make the T wave, the ventricles are relaxing. And here's a little bit of first the pressure, and then the volume, and then the electrical activity, and the heart sounds. The lub for the AV valves closing, and the duct for the semilunar valves closing. And you can see in ventricular systole, the pressure is at the highest peak. Regulation of the cardiac cycle, the SA node controls the heart rate. There's also sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers that control the heart rate as well. There are also regulatory reflex centers that influence heart rate. Additional factors that influence heart rate include physical exercise, body temperature, concentration of various ions, including potassium and calcium. Parasympathetic impulses decrease heart action, while sympathetic impulses increase heart action. And the cardiac center regulates autonomic impulses to the heart. And this is how it works. Receptor picks up the signal. It's sent by a sensory or afferent neuron to the central nervous system. The central nervous system integrates the message, sends it via a motor or efferent neuron to the effector muscle or gland. And we have carotid baroreceptors that send messages to the brain, and then the parasympathetic vagus nerve is activated, or a sympathetic nerve would be activated, and those send signals either to relax or excite. Okay, now let's talk about a little bit. We have a animation about the action potential in cardiac muscle cells. And it's somewhat similar to what we've seen before, except we're just talking about sodium, calcium, and potassium. And we see that very straight, and when the sodium opens up, it really spikes as sodium enters the cell. And then next, when the calcium enters the cell, it drops. And then as the potassium leaves the cell, it drops further again. And that was it. Okay, back to far again. There's a clinical application in section 51 on arrhythmias. I have no slide to cover that. Blood vessels. The blood vessels are organs of the cardiovascular system. They form a closed circuit to and from the heart. These blood vessels include the arteries, which carry blood away from the ventricles of the heart, the arterioles that receive the blood from the arteries and carry blood to the capillaries. Capillaries are the site of exchange of substances between the blood and the body cells, and then the venules receive blood from the capillaries, and the veins carry the blood toward the atria of the heart. And here's a picture of the difference in the layers, in the thickness of the layers, in the lumen, and the valves. of a vein and an artery. Arteries do not have valves. Veins, some of them do. As you can see, the middle layer, the tunica media, or the muscle layer, is very thick in arteries and much thinner in veins. However, the lumen is larger in arteries and smaller in, or larger in veins and smaller in arteries, sorry. Arteries have thick, strong walls. They have an endothelial lining. They have a middle layer of smooth muscle elastic tissue, and they have an outer layer of connective tissue. They carry blood under relatively high pressure. The arterioles have thinner walls than an artery, also have an endothelial lining. The middle and outer layers are thinned. There is some smooth muscle tissue. There's a small amount of connective tissue, and it helps control blood flow in a capillary. And here's a animation of an arteriole. You see the muscular ring around the arteriole. And a smaller branch would be the capillary. Capillaries are the smallest diameter blood vessels. They connect the smallest arteriole and smallest venule. They are extensions of the inner lining of arterioles. The walls are endothelium only, and they are semi-permeable. And here's just some slides of the capillary, showing the nucleus of the endothelial cell, a lumen of a capillary. There's a cell junction there. You can see how tissue flows out from semi-permeable spaces there, little slits in the capillary. And here's an arteriole and a venule, and the capillaries form like a grid or network between the two. This is a little slide about some of the hydrostatic pressure inside and outside. There's an inward force of osmotic pressure and an outward force, including hydrostatic pressure. So in blood flow from arterioles, there's a net outward pressure of 11 milligrams of mercury. But when we look to blood that's flowing to venules, you have a net inward pressure, because the inward force of osmotic pressure is higher than the outward force of the hydrostatic pressure. Venules are microscopic vessels that continue from the capillaries and merge to form veins. They have thinner walls than arterioles. They have less smooth muscle and elastic tissue than arterioles. The veins themselves have thinner walls than arteries. The middle wall is poorly developed. Many veins have flap-like valves. They carry blood under relatively low pressure, and they function as blood reservoirs. And here's some showing a vein with a valve opening, and blood is flowing towards the heart. And here's another vein with closed valves. And here's some of the characteristics of blood vessels. A vein carries blood under relatively low pressure from a venule to the heart. The valves prevent a backflow of blood, serves as the blood reservoir. Veins in your legs especially have valves that prevent backflow, and when those valves function or fail to function, then you have backflow of blood into the lower part of your leg. Blood pressure is the force that blood exerts against the inner walls of the blood vessels. Arterial blood pressure rises when the ventricles contract and falls when the ventricles relax. Systolic pressure is the maximum pressure during ventricular contraction. Diastolic pressure is the minimum pressure when the ventricles relax. Here's a slide of some of the main arteries in the body, starting from the temporal and running down to the dorsalis pedis. And there's a clinical application on the next slide, blood vessel disorders, 15.2. Some of the factors that influence arterial blood pressure: blood volume increases, which leads to blood pressure increases, heart rate increases, and stroke volume increases. Those also lead to pressure increases. If the viscosity of the blood increases, that also leads to blood pressure increases. If peripheral resistance increases, that also leads to blood pressure increases. There's a clinical application for 15.3, the measurement of arterial blood pressure. And another one on space medicine. Next slide. So your BP is determined by the cardiac output and peripheral resistance, according to BP equals CO times PR. Maintenance of blood pressure requires regulation of these two factors. So increased blood pressure will lead to your heart or your body reacting in a negative feedback way by decreasing your heart rate or decreasing the stroke volume, or peripheral resistance decreases. If you decrease the heart rate and stroke volume, it decreases the cardiac output, and that lowers the blood pressure. If blood pressure is decreased and needs to be raised, then the heart rate will increase and the stroke volume will increase. That will increase your cardiac output. Also, increased peripheral resistance will occur. Both of those will also help to raise blood pressure and maintain a normal level. Now here's a flow chart of a little bit how that works. The cardiac output increases, then the blood pressure rises. The baroreceptors in the aortic arch and the cardiac sinuses are stimulated. Sensory impulses are sent to the cardiac center. So then parasympathetic impulses are sent to the heart, and the SA nova is inhibited, heart rate decreases, and blood pressure returns to normal. So then you have, if you have rising blood pressure, stimulation of the baroreceptors in the aortic arch and carotid sinuses. There's sensory impulses sent to the vasomotor center. The vasomotor center is inhibited, so there's less frequent sympathetic impulses to the arterial walls. There's also vasodilation of arterioles, which decreases the peripheral resistance, and blood pressure returns to normal. So either cardiac output increase, which resulted in rising blood pressure, or peripheral resistance increase, which resulted in rising blood pressure. And here we have an animation on arterial resistance and blood pressure. And blood pumps. And flow stopped. New steady state. Blood pressure decreases as blood moves through the arterial system and into the capillary network, so little pressure remains at the venular ends of the capillaries. This is only partly a direct result of heart action. It depends a lot on skeletal muscle contraction, breathing, and venoconstriction. And it's a clinical application 15.5 on hypertension. Central venous pressure refers to veins, except those that are returning to the heart from the lungs and draining into the right atrium. So it's pressure in the right atrium. Factors that influence it alter flow of blood into the right atrium. It affects pressure within the peripheral veins. A weakly beating heart increases central venous pressure. Increase in central venous pressure causes blood to back up into peripheral veins. This can lead to peripheral edema. And it's clinical application 15.6 on exercise in the cardiovascular system. We have the paths of circulation next. The blood vessels can be divided into two major pathways, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit, which includes coronary circulation. And here we have a look at the pulmonary circuit. Again, we have blood coming from the superior or inferior vena cava going into the right atrium through the valve, bicuspid valve, to the right ventricle. Is pumped through the pulmonary semilunar valve, through the pulmonary arteries to either the left or right lung. And we have your gas exchange in capillaries, and the blood comes back through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, through the valve, and then up, pumped through the left ventricle, up through the aortic semilunar valve to the aortic arch, and back out to the body. And here's a little bit of blood flow into an alveolar capillary. There's a slight net outflow of fluid from the capillary. The solutes fail to enter the alveoli, but contribute to the osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid. And any excess water in the alveolus is drawn out by the higher osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid. And the fluid from interstitial space enters the lymphatic capillary or alveolar blood capillary. And then there's a lymph capillary and the blood flow. And we have a lymph flow and a blood flow from there. The systemic circuit is composed of vessels that lead from the heart to all body parts except the lungs and back to the heart. It includes the aorta and its branches, and includes the system of veins that return blood to the right atrium. And here's slide 15.7 of the arterial system, showing the major arteries. As you can see, there's the aorta, and you have branches of the aorta, the subclavian, the brachiocephalic, and you also have vertebral artery that branches off the subclavian. And here's the principal branches of the aorta, the brachiocephalic, left common carotid, and the left subclavian artery are all branched off the arch of the aorta. And then descending aorta is divided into either the thoracic or abdominal aorta, and they have branches from there. The ascending aorta is the right and left coronary arteries. And here's some more pictures of first the aortic arch and the branches coming off it, brachiocephalic, left common carotid, and the left subclavian. Here's the abdominal aorta and the blood supply to the organs of the abdomen and the different branches: celiac, hepatic, renal, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, and the common iliac. And from there, the common iliac, the blood starts flowing to the lower portion of the body. And we have some of the arteries of the brain, head, and neck here. And arteries of the shoulder and upper limb. Some of the more prominent ones are the axillary, the brachial, and then the radial and the ulnar. And here's some arteries of the thoracic and abdominal walls. And you see as those arteries can hug the vertebral body and come very close to the sternum and feed through the cartilage between the ribs. And here's some arteries to the pelvis and lower limb. The more prominent ones are the femoral and the deep femoral arteries, popliteal, the anterior tibial, the posterior tibial, and a dorsalis pedis. Here's the venous system that sends blood back to the heart from the body. Characteristics of the venous pathways. The vessels of the venous system originate with the merging of capillaries and venules in the small veins, and in the small veins in the larger ones. Unlike the arterial pathways, those of the venous system are difficult to follow due to irregular networks and unnamed tributaries. Here's the veins from the brain, head, and neck, and the veins from the upper limb and the shoulder, and the veins from the abdominal and thoracic walls, and the veins from the abdominal viscera. The hepatic portal vein is a very important vein here. It drains deoxygenated blood from the liver. So we have deoxygenated blood in the head and upper limb capillaries, sent through the superior vena cava to the right side of the heart, to the lungs, where the lungs clean it all up, sent to the left side of the heart, and that blood is pumped in the arch, either goes to the ascending aorta and to the head and upper limb capillaries, or the other descending aorta, and then it branches to different arteries all the way to the lower limb capillaries, and gas exchange happens in all those places simultaneously, and it's sent back through the inferior vena cava, and the process starts all over again. Here's the veins from the lower limb and pelvis. You can see some of them have the same names as the arteries, like except for the great saphenous. We'll talk about a little bit about lifespan changes that affect blood vessels and the cardiovascular system in general. Cholesterol deposits in the blood vessels. There's heart enlargement. Death of cardiac muscle cells can occasionally occur. There's an increase in fibrous connective tissue of the heart. There's an increase in adipose tissue of the heart. There's an increase in blood pressure, and there's a decrease in resting heart rate. 15.7 has a clinical application, molecular causes of cardiovascular disease, and in 15.8 talks about coronary artery disease. Okay, so some of the important points that need to be reviewed. These are the outcomes that you have to assess. You should be able to discuss the functions of the organs of the cardiovascular system, distinguish between the various coverings of the heart and the layers that compose the wall of the heart, identify and locate the major parts of the heart and discuss the function of each part, trace the pathway of the blood through the heart and the vessels of the coronary circulation, describe the cardiac cycle and explain how heart sounds are produced, identify the parts of a normal ECG pattern and discuss the significance of this pattern, explain the control of the cardiac cycle, compare the structures and functions of the major types of blood vessels, describe how substances are exchanged between blood and capillaries and tissue fluid surrounding body cells, explain how blood pressure is produced and controlled, describe the mechanisms that aid in returning venous blood to the heart, compare the pulmonary and systemic circuits of the cardiovascular system, identify and locate the major arteries and veins, and describe lifespan changes in the cardiovascular system that affect the heart and blood pressure. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you again next week, Monday. I believe the time will be 4 p.m. for Chapter 16. Thank you again.